Welcome to the IC² Institute Best Practices Library. Today, we are very fortunate to have Stephen Pedigo, professor at LBJ and director of the LBJ Urban Lab. Welcome, Stephen. Thanks for taking the time out to speak with us. If you could just tell our audience a little bit about you and your work, and then we'll dive into your latest publications.
Sure. So this is my first year. We're going actually into my second year at the LBJ School. Prior to being at the LBJ School, I was at the Schack Institute of Real Estate at NYU. You know, most of my work is really around applied economic development strategy. That continues to be what my interests are. I think now I have worked with more than about 50 plus communities across the world, big, small, large, doing economic development strategy. Thinking about engagement around anchor institutions, all of those issues.
Why don't we dive into the latest one, the Playbook for Resiliency, which just came out, and it's focused on Texas, which is, where the IC² Institute has narrowed its focus down.
So I wrote that playbook with Senator Watson, who's now the dean at the Hobby School. And one of the things that I think that became apparent for us back in around May, particularly when we were kind of really at the peak of the pandemic, as local economies and regions were starting to think about reopening their communities, there was a lot of discussion about the idea of how do you reopen a community, businesses, establishments, those types of things, but very little thought thinking about the long-term implications for how we could use this opportunity as a reset. Right? It's interesting, right? I mean, the state of Texas on surface does pretty well in economic development metrics, right? Lowest unemployment across the country, highest firm formation. CEO magazine sets us the best place to start a business. All of those things that the economic development community kind of really hold up as achievements. But when you start to think about the challenges, and what you start to realize is that the development in Texas is actually quite a tale of two Texases, right? Urban Texas versus rural Texas, educated Texas versus non-educated Texas. And so there is absolutely a divide that plays out across the state. And so as part of that, how do you build a more resilient Texas? What are the principles of resiliency? We came up with 9 ideas. One of the things that we suggested in this is just improved cooperation among city and state officials. The other thing I would say about that, which has jumped out even more, is about cooperation among different jurisdictions as well. And one of the things that I think is imperative about this principle of cooperation is that we have to have better cooperation between cities and suburbs regionally, and even cities, suburbs, and rural communities as well, because we all are, to have a fully functioning metropolitan area, it's not about the winner and the loser, but more importantly, how do you build that shared value? So the first principle was around shared governance, really. Second was just about rethinking about how we use our economic development incentives, and a lot of things around workforce development, those types of things. The role of healthcare as not just an important issue for public health, but how do we think about healthcare as an economic development driver? For many local communities, healthcare institutions become those real anchor institutions that could further development. So that being a really important point. Fourthly, upgrading skills. I just did an interview with the folks at the Temple Foundation, and they really believe that economic development is about workforce development. And so, aligning those and the need to continue to align those, embracing alternative energy in the state that is known for energy production. How do we take the knowledge around natural resource production and maybe put that around wind and solar, where there's already some significant investments happening across the state. And then just a couple more, focusing on rural development, frankly, as a priority. This is a state that has urban or rural divide, but really what does it mean to move rural communities forward? And then finally, building on that infrastructure piece, right? An infrastructure that moves metropolitan Texas, but also allows rural Texas to connect to our metropolitan areas. So those are a little bit of the principles and a really quick bumper sticker version.
Can you tell us in particular, what's the latest empirical, field-tested look that you've had that's been supporting these 9 principles? I know we've received your latest report that's linked to Bernie.
You mentioned the work in Bernie, and so as you know, IC² generously funded some of the work that I've been doing in Kendall and Bernie, Texas, and a lot of the issues that we address in this playbook for me come to life in Bernie and even Kendall County. Kendall County is, unlike a lot of Texas, rural Texas, is growing quite fast. It's adding lots of residents. It is trying to think about how it manages growth. But some of the things that become really apparent in terms of the analytics around understanding the economy in Bernie is that, like a lot of rural communities, Bernie and Kendall County are highly dependent upon local economy assumption. And what we know in the pandemic is that those jobs go away really quickly when consumption is kind of turned off at the spigot. And generally speaking, the rule of thumb is you don't really want more than sort of around 65% of your jobs to be tied to local economy work. But in Bernie, it was about 85%. So highly dependent upon local consumption. And so one of the issues that becomes really relevant to them is, how do you build a robust export-based economy?
Well, thank you, Stephen. I'm going to dive a little bit deeper. What does, in your years and years of experience from around the country and the globe, and currently with the pandemic, what does that actually mean? How is that playing out?
I had a great conversation with your director, Art Markman, who visited my class this summer, and we were talking about resiliency from an economic perspective, particularly for rural communities. And one of the things that really struck me by Art's conversation, or the conversation we had with my students, is that for many years, the practice of economic development really wasn't about building more resilient economies. It was about building more efficient, innovative economies. A resilient economy actually may mean you have to have redundancies. It may mean that you need slack in supply chains. And so the question, I think, for the field going forward is that if we're really wanting to develop an economy that is able to resist shock, well, what does that mean? That may mean investing in a diverse portfolio of industries. That may mean helping main businesses think about multiple numbers of suppliers. It may mean about bringing supply chains closer to home, which creates economic opportunity. And so it is a bit of a rethinking about how we have thought about the practice of economic development.
If you had a message right now, so at IC² Institute, we have several communities we engage with. Any messages for these different bins of our communities?
Right. We don't do enough sort of regional planning between rural communities. Encourage investment together, encourage regions to come together, to think about rural regions and counties and cities and community towns to come together to think about shared planning together. That coordination, in my mind, is much more important. In fact, rural communities may have to be more intentional about their development than urban communities.
And let's talk about timings. You call this an opportunity, this impact, this disruption. Can you speak about what we have to do in terms of regional and coordination, but can you speak about timing?
We have an opportunity at this point to really, to dive deep into understanding what do we want our communities to be, what are the assets, and what are the opportunities for the future. And particularly in the state of Texas, we're going to be coming into a new state legislature. And this is really an opportunity to ask ourselves, what are the investments that are important to ensure that long-term recovery happens? And so that means, a reimagining about how we think about economic development incentives. That may mean a real doubling down about encouraging of the right type of infrastructure. The one thing that we hear about a lot of is that the rise of remote work, and the rise that rural communities across this country are going to be able to engage in remote work because they offer great quality of place and all of those things that a lot of people love about living in communities that aren't as urbanized. But that doesn't work without having the right infrastructure in place. The timeline for recovery is the response, but it's also it's a very fast assessment that's approaching quite quickly to understand what are the immediate investments that are needed to ensure that recovery happens.
We're really glad to get your feedback on all of this. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. And I love the work that IC² does.